So far in John, this has just been a really fun study, hasn't it? I have really enjoyed the study of John and seeing the case that John is building for Jesus. In John chapter 20, which we're actually going to get to here pretty soon in a few weeks, John lays out the primary purpose for why he wrote this book. We've looked at it a number of times throughout our study, but I just want to bring it to our attention again. It says, but these are written. Basically what he's saying is the words in this book was written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is what this entire book is about. John is concerned about this. This is what is on John's heart, that he would know, after reading what he has to say about the life of Jesus, that you would know that he is the Son of God and that there is life available to you and I, to all who believe in him. This is what it's all about. And he's built this really cool case as we kind of zoom out and just look at the text as a whole. First of all, we see him state emphatically from the very beginning this very same thing, right? In the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and all things have been made by him, right? He right up front said, listen, Jesus is God, always has been, always will be. He existed from the beginning. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is God. He is divine. And then we begin to see the gospel begin to unfold. And even in the 3rd chapter, he makes this statement that most of us probably know today, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. I mean, he states very, very clearly. And in his audience at the early stages of the book were just to boldly declare this is who Jesus is. He is one with the Father. And for the first several chapters, he's announcing to the world. And we see that some, like the 12, like those who followed him around, they received that. Others did not receive it at all. And in fact, we see this growing animosity towards Jesus and his life and his ministry throughout the book. So we've got those who followed him to the point where they're giving up their lives and following him everywhere. Those who are completely against him, and everybody in between. And some of those in between, they were disciples of Jesus, and just maybe not to the same degree the 12 followed around. Then there was a whole bunch of people, and we see this happen throughout the text, a whole bunch of people who they liked Jesus, they were fans of Jesus, they stuck around Jesus, but they really didn't kind of make it to the end. And they weren't ready to make a decision for Jesus, they just liked him. And we see this whole broad scope of people's response to Jesus. But the whole beginning of the book is all about, this is who Jesus is. How are you going to receive it? And then as we move through the book, later in the book, John begins to narrow his focus a little bit. And remember, from chapter 13 to chapter 17, all of that text is all Jesus teaching to his followers. Jesus teaches to his disciples. And John gives more insight into Jesus' teaching at and around the Last Supper than all of the other gospel writers combined, because he's narrowing his focus. Now he's going to speak to those who are followers of Jesus. He talked about the Holy Spirit, and he talked about enduring persecution, and he talked about the strength that is to come. He talked about abiding in Christ, but he taught his disciples. And now we come to a portion of the text, the last few chapters, and I love what he does here. He sets it up with this big picture, then he narrows it to his followers, and now he begins to give us specific personal encounters that Jesus has with individuals. It's as if John is saying, okay, here's the gospel available for the word. Here is some teaching for those of you who follow it. But here at the very end, he narrows it down and reminds us your relationship with God, your opinion of God, your spiritual walk, this is a personal thing. And he begins to narrow the focus, and we're going to look at, over the course of the next several weeks or a couple months, we're going to look at a few of these characters that Jesus has this personal encounter with. Today, he's going to have the personal encounter with Pilate. Later on, we're going to see Mary, Thomas, and Peter. So today, Jesus is focusing in, or I guess really John is focusing in and causing us to look at this encounter, this personal encounter that Jesus has with Pilate. So we're going to continue in our story in John chapter 18. John chapter 18. And to catch us all up, so we're all on the same page together, we remember that Jesus has just been betrayed by Judas. He's been denied by Peter. He's been wrongfully tried all through the night. And at the end of the night, they finally bring a charge against him that he's a blasphemer. Blasphemers are deserving of death. But they don't have the power to give a death sentence because, as we've come to learn by this point in the text, that Israel has no king at this time because they're under Roman rule. And so the highest political figure, the most influential figure in Israel right now is the chief priest. And they've got certain authority, but ultimately, in order to carry out a death sentence, they needed to go to those who were in rule over Israel at the time, and that was the Roman Empire. Now, Rome had put governors to govern their empire, and the individual who was over Jerusalem at the time, his name was Pilate. Now, we know a little bit about Pilate just from history and things that have taken place. Pilate, his job, the Roman governor's job is pretty decent job, right? He got paid well. He had servants to carry out what he's doing. He was a leader of leaders. And in his primary roles, I know this is slightly oversimplified, but his primary roles were this: make sure Rome gets paid and make sure nobody rebels. Okay, that's really what this is all about, right? Rome wasn't into micromanaging everything. They weren't slave, drivers. They let everybody be as they were, as long as they paid their taxes to Rome, and as long as they didn't just start a rebellion. Okay, so that's Pilate's job. And the only thing is that Pilate has not necessarily met the expectations that Caesar had desired. And so some scholars had even said that he's probably even on his last strike. That, hey, okay, you've not really met our expectations. One more strike and you're out, kind of thing. And so there's this political unease, unrest kind of going on with Pilate, and the Jews know that. So what we're going to see in this story is a little bit of a power struggle, where the Jews, the chief priests, the priests and their officials leverage Pilate's status and his challenges that he's got, and so we see that begin to unfold. So here's Pilate, a man that just wants peace, right? He doesn't want to be disturbed. You guys do your thing. I'm going to do my thing, and we're all going to be just fine. And this is kind of the setting that we walk into in John chapter 18. So what we're going to do, we're just going to walk through this story, make some observations, and see what we come up with at the end here. John chapter 18, starting verse 28. It says, "Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas, who's the high priest, to the palace of the Roman governor. But now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover." Okay, here's just a little side note. This caught me just funny. So the Jews who had, at this point, beaten, wrongfully accused, brought false accusations against him. They've beat. I mean, Jesus probably have black eye and bloody lip right now, beard pieces pulled out, spit in his face. They have been brutal to Jesus. They've now decided they're going to kill him. So this is their thought process, right? We have wrongfully condemned this man, this innocent man, to death. We want to murder this man, but they can't go into the home of a Gentile, or else they'll be ceremonially unclean, right? Next day's Passover. Passover is like the Christmas of the Jews, right? Like it's like a big, big deal. You don't want to miss out and be unclean, and then you can't take part in all of the festivities of Passover, right? And so they don't want to miss out on that. So this is their thought process. I'm gonna go to this Pilate so that I can murder a man, but I want to make sure I keep my hands clean. Anytime our religious practices supersede our heart for God, something has gone very off. Nothing to do with the rest of the story, but that's just interesting to me. So they bring him to his palace. I think this is also power play, right? They don't want to go inside, but they want Pilate to charge Jesus immediately. They don't want to wait a couple days. They want a decision right now. They come to Pilate. They're not going to go up into his palace to Pilate. So they say, hey, Pilate, you come out to us. I know you're in charge, but I'm going to do this little power play thing. You come to me. Well, what are you going to do about it? So Pilate comes outside of his palace to him, and here we have the chief priests who have Jesus bound and chained and beaten with a crowd of people around him. Pilate asked the most logical question. So Pilate, what charges are you bringing against this man? Right? That's obvious. You're bringing me a criminal. You want me to condemn him. What charges? And they say, verse 30, if he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Saying, oh, don't question me. Pilate, don't question us. You think we'd bring you somebody? No, Pilate, come on. He's guilty. We're bringing him guilty. Don't question us. AKA, Pilate's smart. We don't have anything, right? That's what it is. They had no accusation. There was nothing they could bring. And so he said, hey, we want you to charge this man. We don't really have anything, but we want you to charge him. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. He said, get out of here. You handle this, right? You have authority. I've given you authority to handle this. Handle it. Don't bring it to me. I don't need to be involved in this. But we have no right, the Jews say, we have no right to execute anyone. Okay, now Pilate's just probably annoyed, right? So you're going to bring me this man that you won't tell me what his charges are. You want me to execute him without knowing anything. So to get rid of all of them for a minute, he brings Jesus inside his palace. Pilate then, I'll notice this too. Verse 32, this happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. So here's this power struggle between the Jews and between Pilate. Pilate going, I've got the authority, you're under my rule. The Jews saying, I know how to wiggle my way around this, I'm smarter than you. I can leverage you, you have to do what I say, or else I can make a big stink and your job is over. There's power play back and forth, and then John just inserts this little thought. This happened because Jesus foretold this a long time ago. Listen, priest, you think you're in control? Pilate, you think you have all the authority? Just reality check. Jesus said all this was going to happen a long time ago. There's nothing you can do about it. He rules supreme. Period. No matter what the situation looks like, Jesus is still in control. Pilate then went back inside the palace and he summoned Jesus and he asked him, are you the king of the Jews? It's a very simple question. And it had a very black and white, it was going to make his job easy, right? Get rid of the crowd, get rid of all the priests, get rid of all of the political stuff that's going on here. Let's bring this man in. I'm going to ask him if he's the king of the Jews. If he says yes, then he is setting himself up against Rome, because the Jews can't have a king because Caesar is king. He's the only one that's in control. If you say that you are a king, you are a threat to Caesar, and we'll deal with you quickly and strongly. If you say no, if you're just backing down and I'm not showing any kind of threat to you or anything, if you just say no and you're tucking tail and going home, then I'll just send everybody away. And it's very simple. Pilate wanted this to be clean. He wanted this to be easy. He wanted this just to be peaceful and for everybody to go home and all of us to just go back to our lives as they were. There's some of us who are just wired that way, aren't we? We're like, I don't like the tension. Let's just everybody be happy and let's just get along. And right, there's some of us who are in there. I'll be honest, I'm kind of that way. Or not kind of, I'm that way. Right? Let's just be happy, right? Let's just get along. Let's just put all this to rest and deal with it quickly so we can just go home and go back to life. Some of you are like, oh, I can't stand those people. Man, you're just pushovers. And we're all like, well, you're just a jerk, right? But there's some of us who let's just make it smooth. That's what Pilate was doing. We're just gonna make a quick answer. Either you're a rebel and I'll hand you over to them and they can do their thing and I can go back to my life, or you're not a threat and everybody can go home and let's just smooth this out, because anything that was gonna cause waves would threaten his job security. And so he just wanted things to be smooth sailing. So he asked this very black and white question. Are you the king of the Jews? Yes, you're executed. No, we're all just going to go home. And Jesus, he just makes a great question. He says, is that your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? Again, Peter's like, no, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. But here's the thing. Pilate was thinking very theoretical, right? Okay, here's this big picture. Like, here's this guy. Let's just deal with it on theory. And Jesus, what he does all the time is he makes it intimately personal. Remember when Jesus was teaching, he was with his disciples, and he asked the question, who do they say that I am? And they gave all these different kind of answers, but he was really just setting them up for the question that really mattered when he said, who do you say that I am? Jesus wants to make this personal. This religious thing, this spiritual life, this deal that we have in our faith journey or whatever, this is not just this theoretical spiritual existence. Jesus is going to make this personal. So Pilate says, this is who they say you are, and Jesus says, but who do you say that I am? And his response, am I a Jew? Pilate replied, meaning, this has nothing to do with me. I want to stay out of this. Why would you, a king of the Jews, impact me, a Roman officer? What a stupid question. It was your people and your chief priest who handed you over to me. What is it you have done? I think he's getting a little bit partially maybe intrigued, but mostly just frustrated. What is it you've done? Why do they want to kill you? Why do they want to kill you? You're not saying that you're a king and you're asking these weird questions and what have you done? Just let's get down to brass tacks. What are we going to do with you? And Jesus said this, and I believe that when Jesus began to speak this time, I believe something started to stir within Pilate. Something started to stir within him that I think he did not even quite understand. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. In other words, Pilate, listen, if my kingdom was from this world, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. But now my kingdom is from another place. See, Pilate wanted a black and white answer. Jesus was brought to his doorstep, and he wanted to be able to have a very, very clean yes or no. Jesus was brought to his doorstep, and he wanted to just be able to put Jesus in a box. Crazy, harmless. One of those two categories has got to define this man, and yet Jesus gives an answer that doesn't allow him to be put in either one of those boxes. He says, my kingdom is not from this world. In other words, I'm a king, but I'm no threat to Rome. Well, what do you do with that? I'm a king, but I'm no threat to Rome. I'm not going to bring my army in here and wipe you guys out. I'm not even going to say that I'm going to do that. If I wanted to, then it wouldn't really be an issue. But this is not my kingdom. My kingdom is not of this world. And all Pilate heard was kingdom. And he goes, so you are a king then, said Pilate. And Jesus answered, you are right in saying I am a king. And again, God is doing something in Pilate's heart, I believe. You were right in saying I'm a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. So that's a bold statement, especially to a Roman. You see, in Pilate's mind, there's all these different things that are going on. He's got a certain worldview that is very, very different than the Jewish worldview. He's got a spiritual truth that is very different than the Jewish spiritual truth. And in his mind, there's all these gods and the sons of the gods, and some visit man and different. They got all these different gods that they worship, right? This Roman spiritual worldview. Is the Romans' perspective truth? And then there's the people that they oversee, the Jewish faith, and there's this one God, and the Creator is this truth. But then even within that, there's all these different sects. There's the Zealots who have their own truth, and the Pharisees who have their own truth, and the Sadducees who have their own truth. And now Jesus, coming out of this, says that he's the truth, and he sets himself apart from them and apart from the Roman truth. And there's all this different truth that is going around and vying for everyone's attention. And Jesus says, anyone on the side of truth listens to me. Okay, I'm the bottom line. I am the foundation. I am truth. And Pilate asks, what is truth? Now listen, we got to know, Pilate was not like actually asking a question. Oh, Jesus, that's interesting. What is truth? Oh, he's a prisoner. And at this point, crazy-ish. Intriguing, but crazy. It says, what is truth? That's probably the biggest question anyone could ever ask. The deepest, most foundational question any person could ever ask. What is truth? And get this, he's asking it to the one person most qualified in all of human history to ever be able to answer that question. What is truth? Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews. He asked the greatest, biggest question that could possibly ever be asked to the one person qualified to answer the question, and then he walked away without an answer. What a tragedy. With this, he went out again to the Jews and he said, I find no basis for a charge against him. I want you to notice that because he's going to say this multiple times. I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? He's saying, listen, he's innocent. He's not a threat. I don't know what all the fuss is about. And they shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now, Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. He says, listen, there's nothing wrong with him. I believe in this conversation, Jesus was getting to Pilate. This thing about truth and his kingdom of not of this world. He was maybe a little bit crazy, but I like him. So I'm not going to execute him. And the response that he got, he was not expecting. He's like, hey, I can release him. But they said, give us a murderer and somebody who led a rebellion. This time we get this insight from Matthew chapter 27, another place where we see this exact same story. And listen to what it says. It says, Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat right around the time where he was going to let Barabbas go. On the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. Now, if you were Pilate, wouldn't that make you start to think? Your wife just tells you this man that the crowd wants executed is innocent and she's been tormented all night through a dream. Listen, she went to bed and fell asleep possibly before Jesus was ever even arrested. The fact that Jesus showed up and heard dreams as an innocent man that Pilate needed to leave alone is probably something that Pilate would have listened to, as he would have been most likely a spiritually open man, just not necessarily to faith in God. Pilate's put in a tough spot. And we get to chapter 19, and Pilate's got to do something. The crowd's getting crazy. It says, then Pilate took Jesus and he had him flogged. That's just one quick little statement. But in that statement, I think it's important that we know what just happened. Pilate said, he's innocent, but I know you want him killed. Here, maybe if I torture him first, that'll be good enough for you. Because they would have whipped him, and on the end of these whips, there would have been these chunks of metal, this shrapnel, that would have just stuck into his back and sides. And if that wasn't enough, and that was not the least of it, then it would rip it out and tear him to shreds. And these soldiers were pros at it. Like they were skilled at this kind of torture. They knew where to hit to avoid the major arteries and the organs that would kill a man. So they'd torture you, do as much damage as possible without killing you, so you'd have to endure it all. This is messed up. So Pilate says, well, let's torture him for a little bit. And then after doing that, it says the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and they put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe, that purple being a sign of royalty. And they went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. They made an absolute, complete mockery and fool of Jesus. All the while, Pilate was like, I still don't see anything wrong with him. Look at verse 4. He went out to them and he said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." Basically saying, listen, has he not suffered enough? Look, he's what you already did to him, the black and blue, the bloodied lip, the beard pulled out, the spit in his face, it's nothing compared to what I did to him. He's suffered enough for a day. Let's just be done with it. But verse 6, as soon as the chief priests and the other officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" Now listen, what we know from reading the other Gospels and their account of the same story is that the crowd starts shouting, "Crucify." But listen, the crowds didn't all hate Jesus. There were those in the crowds who did. Chief priests, their officials. Quite possibly, they were the minority in the crowd that actually hated Jesus and wanted him killed. But they were brilliant influencers. And the crowd was just a crowd. And so they mingled themselves through the crowd, and through their influence, they shifted the voice and they controlled the voice of the crowd until everyone in the crowd was shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and you crucify him. But as for me, third time, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to the law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. This is a very telling statement. A lot of what I think about Pilate partially comes from this verse right here. When he heard this, he was even more afraid, which meant prior to this point, he was already afraid. But what was he afraid of? Was he afraid of the crowd? That if the crowd got too big, if the crowd got out of control, if the crowd sent word to, or if anyone sent word to Caesar to find out that he was losing control again, that his job would be on the line, that he would lose his power, that he would lose all that, was that what he was afraid of? No, because He became more afraid, not when he heard more about the crowd, but when he learned more about Jesus. He says when he heard that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, he became more afraid. Why? Because he was starting to realize that Jesus might actually be who he said he was. And if Jesus truly is the son of, in his worldview, would have maybe been the son of one of the gods, then he just flogged the son of one of the gods. And he didn't know what he was going to do with that. Not to mention that he kind of knew he was in a bit of a pickle. This crowd's not going away. I've done everything I can to silence the crowd, but here's Pilate saying, I've done everything I can to silence the crowd, but they won't be silent. The crowd keeps growing, and they become more and more hostile. They keep shouting. I can't do anything about the crowds, and they're not going away. And the more I learn about this Jesus, the more I learn that he may be the Son of God. There's something about the way that he talks. He's a criminal. He's beaten. There's something about the way that he has this weird humility and strength mingled together in a way that I've never seen before. There's something about the way that here he is as claiming to be king and looking at that crucifixion, and yet he does so with love and grace. What the world has never seen before. There's something different about him, and now he claims to be the Son of God. What if it's true? Then Pilate's beginning to realize the decision he's going to have to make. Either I side with the crowd and I execute a God, which really probably is not going to go well for me. Or I side with God and I execute my career. He finds himself in a tough spot. And when he hears that Jesus claims to be a son of God, he's like, okay, I need to have a conversation with this guy again. He pulls him back inside. And in verse 8, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. And he went back inside the palace. And this time, I think, with maybe even a little bit of anger. Not an anger that comes from hatred, but an anger that comes from fear. An urgency in his voice now. And he says, where do you come from? You got to tell me this, Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. And again, the anger rises up in him. He said, do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said, do you realize I've got the power either to free you or to crucify you? Talk to me, Jesus. What's going on? And Jesus answered in a way that I believe must have sent chills down Pilate's back when he heard this response. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Jesus said, listen, you're scared, but I'm in control, not you. And then as if to say, listen, I know what you're thinking. Because Peter's fear was that what Jesus was saying was right, and I'm going to do wrong by God himself, and I'm going to reap the wrath of that for the rest of my life. He's afraid of committing a sin against God, and Jesus, knowing his thoughts, responds directly to them. He says, you have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Pilate, knowing he's not just the authority, but he's reading my very thoughts. And it says, from then on, Pilate tried to set him free. But, and this is key, but the Jews kept shouting. Pilate knew what he wanted to do. Pilate knew what he needed to do. Pilate knew that he had looked into the face of truth and the truth had spoken into him. Pilate knew there was something happening inside of him. There was something churning in his heart. There was something coming alive in him from this encounter with Jesus. He knew what he needed to do, but the crowds kept shouting. If you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Doesn't that sound like something a Roman would say? But again, the crowd is leveraging their knowledge of Pilate's situation. See, they don't want a king. They just want Jesus killed. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out. He sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement. It was a day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." And one last plea, "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," says the highest spiritual leader in Israel. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So I was reading this story in other texts, and I've come across Luke. Luke tells the story, and he adds a phrase in there that when I read it, it just caught me. He said, "But then with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released Barabbas and surrendered Jesus to their will." That phrase, I've not been able to get it out of my head all week. They surrendered Jesus to their will. What a sad, sad ending to this encounter with Jesus. Surrendered Jesus to their will. Here's the thing. In this situation, as powerful and mighty as Pilate thought that he was, there was no way out of this situation without surrendering something. Right? There's no possible way to navigate this political and spiritual encounter without surrender. Either he was going to have to surrender Jesus to the will of the crowd, or he would have to surrender his will to Jesus. But when it came down to it, he realized that if I surrender Jesus to the crowd, it's going to be for my well-being. And if I surrender my will to Jesus, it might cost me. And Jesus, it's either me or you, so sorry, bud. You know, I believe this is a dilemma that many people face on a regular basis. You see, here's this Pilate. Truth be told, he didn't want to make a decision about Jesus either way. He just wanted to let things be. He just wanted to deal with Jesus quickly and decisively so that he could go back to living his comfortable Roman governing life. He didn't want to make a decision for Jesus. He didn't want to make a good one. He didn't want to make a bad one. He wanted to make none. And yet there comes moments in life where we are brought into situations just like this. And no matter how much we want to just kind of keep the peace and ignore what's going on around us, we are forced to make a decision one way or the other. And inevitably, the decision is going to require some kind of surrender. We will either surrender Jesus to the will of the crowd to maintain the peace so that I can go back living how I was living before, or I will surrender my will to Jesus and just let it be. Let what happens, happens. See, I know this was foretold. I know that God saw all this before it ever happened, but I wonder if what would have happened if Pilate would have chose differently. In fact, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that we're not going to see Pilate someday in heaven. He had a real encounter with Jesus. We don't know what he did with it afterwards. If we don't see him in heaven, I would almost guarantee you that morning he was rudely interrupted was a morning that he will probably replayed in his mind 1 billion times before the day that he died. In remorse, knowing that he did not choose wisely. See, there are pilots everywhere. There are pilots in the church. What do I mean? There are people that attend church on a regular basis that are around Jesus, and frankly, because they like him. Like Pilate. He liked Jesus. And it was more than just a liking Jesus. There was something about Jesus that really captivated Pilate. There's something about him that stirred within him, and he knew there was some truth there. There are pilots who sit in church every week, or at least once a month. And you like Jesus. You've encountered Jesus. You might even believe that he's the Son of God, or like Pilate, at least believe there's maybe a good chance. I know there's not a super clear-cut formula laid out in Scripture, like this is exactly the steps you must take to be saved. I mean, we see the thief on the cross, and we see just different things, and the calling of the disciple. We see these, but Paul kind of lays out two really broad principles surrounding salvation. He says this: if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. You see, Pilate had the belief thing down. Not that he raised from the dead, that was kind of before it happened, but he had the belief in Jesus, I think. You see the fear, you see the frustration, you see him defending himself about Jesus over and over and over again. I believe that he had the belief thing. The thing that Pilate lacked was the confessing him as Lord. And we make a big deal out of the words. It's not the words. The confessing Jesus as Lord is not the words saying that Jesus is Lord. Anybody can do that. It's confessing him with your life that he is Lord, or should I say, sovereign and in control of all areas of our lives. Pilate never went there. He believed that he was maybe God. He believed that he liked him. He believed, I think, that even that he did hold some kind of truth. But here's where it went wrong. When it was time to make a decision about Jesus, his default, what he wanted to do was make no decision. But we know, listen, it's not like, do you love Jesus or do you hate Jesus? It's, are you committed to Jesus or not? Right? So to think I can go through the spiritual life, be around spiritual things, but never really make an active decision for Jesus, you're kidding yourself. It doesn't work that way. See, God brings us all to a point that Pilate was brought to, and will you choose Jesus or not? See, Pilate thought that he could play the middle ground, but in the end, he handed Jesus over to the will of the crowd. If you're one of those churchgoers, you go to church and you like Jesus, you maybe even believe in Jesus, but you've never come to a point where you just said, listen, I've surrendered my life to Jesus. I surrender my will to Jesus. I commit myself to Jesus. It's not just that I like him, I'm his, and I'm surrendering everything that's his, and what happens, and that's not going to affect my devotion to my God. I would challenge you. See, and here's the thing. I would challenge you to make that. You can even today just make that. Maybe go, I don't know where I'm at, but listen, just why not today? Let's say, God, whatever it costs, whatever it looks like, I'm yours. God, forgive me for the times that I have surrendered you to the crowd for my own well-being. Jesus, I want to surrender daily, picking up our cross daily, surrendering our will to that of Jesus. And here's the thing, some of us, we live in environments where standing for Jesus never brings us to that conflict moment that Pilate had. I grew up in Christian circles. I grew up with people who liked the fact that I liked Jesus, and it made it really, really easy. And some of you live there even still today. And yet I know there are people in here today who that's not your story. In fact, when you go into your workplace, it's challenging. I've got a couple of friends. I don't know a whole lot about their spiritual background. I know one's definitely not a believer. I know one, well, I don't know much about him except as far as spiritual believing. So he posted this video about creation. No comment, just a repost about this video about creation and scientific evidence for creation. Another mutual friend, somebody I'm pretty sure is not a believer, just puts this quote, this statement. All he says is this: "You've got to be a special kind of stupid to believe that." All right. Oh, good argument. The truth of the matter is, some of you are related to that guy. And to say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, and I believe in his word, and I believe that he's sovereign, and he's ultimately in control of everything in my life, and he affects everything. The response that you get, even from your own family members, is you're a special kind of stupid for believing that. You go into your workplaces where standing for Jesus or even being known as a Christian puts you in a lesser light with your coworkers. Or your friends in your social circles, the people, if they know that you stand for and believe in Jesus, then you are instantly tagged as the special kind of stupid. Can I encourage you today to do what Pilate didn't have the courage to do? To stand for Jesus? You see, Jesus has just talked, and he's just taught his followers. He said, listen, they're going to hate you because they hated me first. Don't be surprised by this, but listen, because of the power of the Holy Spirit living inside of you, you can stand. You can have the strength that you need. God will give you what you need to stand. Would you do what Pilate was too cowardly to do? And let me say this too, and maybe it sounds like I harp on this topic maybe a lot, but it's just the world that we live in. Some people right now, you hear this, you're like, oh, I'm going to make a stand. I'm going to go home and I'm going to drop a truth bomb via a meme on Facebook, and I'm a Christian. Cool. And you know, okay, fine. If you want to tell everybody on Facebook that you're Christian, that's fine. But can I encourage you, just give you a tip in that, okay? If you're going to stand for Jesus on social media, okay, stand on Jesus. Don't leverage Jesus for your agenda, okay? If you want to boldly declare that I'm a follower of Jesus, then focus on his character. Then focus on his grace. Don't focus on your current event and cut and paste Jesus into it and call that standing for Jesus. It's not standing for Jesus. Usually what you do is you offend everyone who disagrees with you, and you make Jesus look bad. You drag him through it too. And you know what we're doing? We're being like Peter, and we grab our sword out and we run into the crowd and just start spinning in circles and trying to hit anybody who can bleed. It's not cowardly, or that's not courageous, that's cowardly. You want to stand for Jesus? Do it eye to eye with somebody. You want to stand for Jesus? You tell the person that thinks that you're a special kind of stupid, hey, let's talk a little bit more about that. If we're going to make an impact on our culture, it's going to happen through interaction, not by screaming via keyboard on from our desk. Stand for Jesus, like literally, not just digitally. Okay? And here's the other thing we need to keep in mind. I said there's pilots everywhere. There's people who literally feel this tension between here's the crowd and I've encountered Jesus and I've got to make a decision to make. And they're all over the church, but you know what? They're all outside the church too. And you know what I believe when I read this story? The Pharisees, the the teachers, those who hated Jesus stirred up the crowd. But I would bet that just like any crowd, they didn't hate Jesus as much as the other ones did. In fact, if Jesus would have had a personal encounter with many of them, if Jesus would have been brought to their doorstep, they might have actually just made that decision for Jesus. But instead, they get soaked up in the crowd. And we as followers of Jesus have to remember that just because somebody doesn't go to church, just because somebody haven't put their faith in Jesus Christ, doesn't mean they hate him. It might just mean because they're caught up in the crowd, because that's just what you do when you don't know Jesus. What it might mean is that if somebody would bring Jesus to their doorstep like Jesus was brought to Pilate's, then maybe they might have the courage that Pilate never had. That maybe that instead of as us within the church or those who are followers of Jesus, instead of just blasting and making these broad assumptions about those who don't know Jesus, what if we took the time to interact with them one-on-one like Jesus did with Pilate? Pilate was the one that was going to send him to be crucified, and he knew it, and yet he took the time to speak truth into his life. Did you catch that? What if we as the body of Christ, what if we as followers of Jesus assumed that those who did not know Jesus weren't antagonistic to it, but rather just needed an opportunity for somebody to bring Jesus to their doorstep? If we're going to see a revival, and I know that word's overused, if we're going to see people turning to Jesus again, it's not because of our brilliant marketing schemes on social media. It's because we go into people's lives and have conversations and bring Jesus to the doorstep. It's because we assume that they're just like Pilate, trying to make sense of this spiritual truth. What is truth? And there are people outside the church, there are people who are outside the faith that are wrestling with the same questions that Pilate is wrestling with, and will we bring Jesus to their doorstep? But instead of doing it with clubs and swords and torches, let's do it with the love and grace that Jesus offers. Let's change our thinking. Let's be reminded that Pilates are everywhere. What if we could bring Jesus to them? If we're going to see a great turning to Jesus, it's going to happen in cubicles at work, and in garages leaning over an engine block, and in neighborhoods, conversations around a mailbox. Let's bring Jesus to their doorstep, knowing they're wrestling just like Peter, or they're wrestling just like Pilate. And they wrestle just like you and I do at times. So I believe there's people that God has placed in their life that they're ready to surrender their will to Jesus if they just had that encounter with him. God, use us to bring Jesus to a world that's asking the question, what is truth? Father, we thank you so much for the way that you get personally involved